Hi, Dr. Matt Bowker here, coming to you as the Profounder Professor. And today I just want to finish up with Plato by reading you, actually. It's probably bad form for YouTube, but reading you a very short passage that I think is the center and the fulcrum of ancient philosophy, Western and Eastern, and as I think eventually we'll get to see modern philosophy as well, certainly in the West. It's not often discussed as the centerpiece of the Republic. Um, there is a lot to choose from in the Republic, so there's a lot to think about. But this, I think, is really the core of what Plato is worried about. And it's important to think about this and to take it very seriously because it is a perennial concern. And it's one that is voiced early on, and I still am not sure that we have an adequate answer to it. Um, uh, it relates to what we'll talk about later eventually when we talk about Tocqueville, probably, and the tyranny of the majority. It relates to Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments and Philip Zimbardo's conformity experiments. It's really a question of the individual's ability to withstand social interference, public interference at the level of the soul. And so let me just read this really short excerpt and think about what's being said. I wish I knew the original Greek, but I don't, but it's a good translation. And the interlocutors of Socrates are talking again about the nature of the philosopher, and they say, the philosophic nature we've postulated, if it's taught right, must be in the course of its growth developed in suitable soil. If not, then the opposite will happen. Or do you share the common view that our young men are really corrupted just by the sophists? And we've talked about the sophists as this group of sort of public relations mercenaries who take would-be philosophers and turn them into essentially candidates for power in ancient Athens without any philosophical grounding really to speak of. And the question arises, can the influence of individual sophists really corrupt a person or persons to any extent? Isn't it really the public who are themselves sophists on a grand scale and who give a complete training to young and old, men and women, turning them into just the sort of people they want? It's a terrifying, almost sort of Orwellian question. Well, when do they do that? This is when the people crowd into the seats in the assembly or the law courts or the theater or the agora, or get together in camp or any other popular meeting place, and with a great deal of noise and a great lack of moderation, shout and clap their approval or disapproval of whatever is proposed or done, until the rocks and the whole place re-echo and redouble the noise of their boos and applause. Can a young person's heart remain unmoved by all this? How can this person's individual training in philosophy stand the strain? Won't he, she, or they be swamped by the flood of popular praise and blame and carried away with the stream until he finds himself, or she or they find themselves agreeing with popular ideas of what is admirable or disgraceful, behaving like the crowd and becoming one of them? Yes, that's bound to happen, they agree. So the question here is, and it's remarkable, I think, pathos in this passage. It's really stated with a great deal of sympathy. And the question is it possible for a young person, someone who's not really yet seasoned, to withstand the power of popular praise and blame? The way that it works on us, infiltrates our hearts and minds and gets us thinking without even knowing that this is happening, that really what the majority or the mass believes has to be right. And Tocqueville later, we can talk about, will say that it does this through a kind of a curious mathematics where we all say, well, if we're equal, then two heads are better than one, and the majority of heads is better than a minority, and it's a little bit of complicated calculation, and it's not the whole reason this thing works the way it does, but Plato notices it and is aware of it and is aware of its power, particularly in democracies. And I think it's really remarkably sensitive in a way of Plato, who's not usually described as a sensitive guy, to think about the state of a young person's heart or soul and how it's going to possibly withstand the strain of the boos and the applause and this overwhelming sense of approval or disapproval, or of desirability and undesirability that comes from the mass, that comes from the crowd that he, she, or they are in. And I even have taken to calling this the metaphor of the flood, even though it's not really even a metaphor. He just says, won't it be like a flood that carries the philosopher in training away with its stream, with its powerful stream, the force of the current of the modern, or what is at any time the contemporaneous or modern thought times, what people believe. It's so frightening to think about, because that means if we're dubious about the ability of young philosophers to withstand this strain, then we have to question the training of young philosophers and whether or not we'll ever have true philosophers who are really independent thinkers. And for Plato, that's the crux of the Republic. Without the philosopher rulers, there's no republic that's well guided. And for most of ancient, I would say, to start with the Western philosophy, we'll talk about the Hellenistic philosophers probably next time. That's one of the major questions. How do you withstand the popular conventional wisdom of the day? How do you separate yourself from that? How do you step out of it and reflect back on it? How do you come to terms with it and make peace with it without being influenced, and while retaining your own true values and your true set of principles and your true knowledge? And we can now recall back to when we talked about the cave allegory and other parts of Plato and see how it kind of links up with some of those ideas. This, of course, would be as opposed to someone like Cephalus, who is a character we meet early on in the Republic, who's old and fairly directly described as someone who's near death. And the group of young companions asks Cephalus what it's like to be old and near death. And Cephalus says, it's great. I, for many reasons, no longer am a slave to my appetites. I'm not full of lust. I don't need to get intoxicated all the time. I don't need to fill my belly up every night. I don't need to believe what the majority believes. I can think for myself. I can finally have some peace. And that's a more mature stance that we would like to be able to find in a young philosopher, but it's very hard. The Hellenistic philosophers that kind of come onto the scene after Plato, at sort of the decline of the Greek Empire and the start of the Roman Empire, or really into the Roman Empire, and then some of them, like the Stoics, last another maybe 2,000 years, are asking themselves the same question. And so are the philosophers or philosopher who wrote something like the Tao Te Ching, which is a book about the way and its power, and how do we get ourselves on the path without being distracted by the paths that are set out by others who may have been less thoughtful than we want to be, or those who hold only conventional opinions and beliefs. And I think this is the crux of what's going on in Plato. I mean, I think he's really deeply worried about this. And if you miss this in reading Plato, you might miss a clue to ancient Greek philosophy and possibly all political philosophy that really shares this central concern.